Hey, good evening, everybody. See, we don't have a full class today, so I'll just give it another minute and then we can begin. Okay, so we'll start off today. I just did Learning Unit 2, Theme 1 and 2 already, so that is a pre-recorded session. So when you do get an opportunity, please just go over that. So in that specific session, supplier sourcing was covered as well as supplier selection and development. So reasons for choosing either a single supplier or a multiple supplier, but you can go through that recording, which is uploaded on the YouTube channel in your own time. Just from an update perspective, IceTask 2 has been released today. You have until the 10th of September 23:59 p.m. to submit those. I did put a little bit more in terms of the expectations. So I think I did cover it in a few classes ago that I will start off a little bit on you guys do what you feel is best, and then we'll start putting in a little bit more content in terms of how assignments should be done, the caliber of assignments, having a cover page, a introduction, a body, a conclusion, just so that there's a little bit more stability with the assignment and a little bit more structure. Um, in terms of your assignment 1, I haven't gotten to grading that as yet, so I should have all of those graded by this weekend. And your results should reflect another 5 days from then once OC results has it released. I just had a quick brief look at the memo as well. If there is any concerns or any questions that you have about the assignment, I want to cover it in a national support session, so post the assignment. And I think we are doing really well in terms of our PACER right now. So as we stand, today is the 3rd of September. We would have covered 2 IceTasks right now, 1 assignment, and all of our learning units post this session right until learning unit 4. So we would have at least another session to go. So next week, I will be doing a pre-recorded session, and I'll do that on your learning unit 1, learning unit 5, theme 1, sorry. And then on the 17th of September, will be our next live lecture, and I want to use that as a national support session. So look out for a new link called National Support Session. I really want everybody to join this because I will go through the assignment 1, sort of very generalized in terms of errors that was made, how can we then improve for assignment 2, and then possibly things that we need to take into consideration or themes we can pull into when you get closer to your assignment. So I think we do have some time to actually pull that forward before we move on to the next session. So we don't have a lot of time. I mean, we've got less than 2 months to go. And then your exam then begins on the 18th of November, but our sessions finish on the 29th of October. That's our last session. So we'll try and cover as much as possible. I'm going to get in another national support session post assignment 2. And then we'll use our last session on the 29th of October as our revision session. And then any tips and stuff I have for you for the examination. Okay, I'm going to get started because this theme is pretty long. Yeah, I just want you to understand it well enough. I haven't had sight on anything from an assignment 2. It hasn't been released as yet to me, so it hasn't obviously been released to you as well. But when we do get that, then I'll cover it in the next few weeks or so. I think your next assignment is now due on the 16th of October. So you have just more than a month to go for that. So focus on your ICE task for now. Your next ICE task after today's one is then due on the 17th of September. And then you have the next one on the 8th of October. So we should be fine to cover all of that. I may move the 4th ICE task just a little bit later because I see your assignment 2 is actually on the 16th of October. So I don't want you to focus on an ICE task and not focus on an assignment. So I'll move that ICE task to just a little bit later. So just a few days after your assignment 2 is due. Okay, so let's kick off. Any questions so far before I start? Okay, I take it as there's nothing. So our session today is going to be global sourcing. And the concept of global sourcing, or the textbook definition of global sourcing, is when you integrate various requirements from across the world, so different units from across the world. You're looking at common items, processes, technologies, and supplies. So you want to source items that is not from a local perspective, but more so from a global perspective. So global sourcing often aims to exploit global efficiencies in the delivery of a product or service. So finding a global supplier that does best practices and how can you now adopt those best practices, products, etc. And then we look at it more from an importing perspective. These efficiencies include low-cost skilled labor, low-cost raw materials, and other economic factors like tax break and low trade tariffs. So a lot of times when products are manufactured from an international or global perspective, they do have better economies of scale because they have lower costs on raw materials as well as labor. So they're able to produce in mass quantities, taking into account lower cost factors that go into play. Therefore, it makes sense for local businesses from a South African perspective to import raw materials, components, materials, etc. from a global supplier. So this is basically the context of where global sourcing is coming from. Okay, and this is majority of where the theme is sitting. And you know, what is the advantages, disadvantages, the risks? How does logistics play a part? Because logistics is a big part of global sourcing and attracting products from an international perspective. So the first part of it is purchasing, okay, and international purchasing. So international purchasing, as you can imagine, is a little bit more complex than if you're buying from a local domestic supplier in terms of information. So communication needs to be at the forefront in terms of this. You're speaking to people that is a completely different dialect to you. So therefore, you need to be very clear and concise with what you're ordering, the products, etc. So it's always beneficial to get samples, especially if it is a part, component, fabric, material, apparel, etc. It's always nice to work on a sample first before you actually go ahead and purchase full products. Global clearing. So because international purchasing and global sourcing is at the forefront right now, a lot of people are doing it. Global clearing and forwarding has become quite big in the last few years. despite the exchange rate and the instability in terms of that, from a rand dollar perspective, people are still finding it easier, cheaper, and even from a quality perspective better to source internationally than it is to source locally. And obviously you have to look at it from a logistics perspective. So procurement dealing on a international market level. So if you do have a procurement manager or a procurement department, some of the skills that they would need to possess is good communication skills, business knowledge and business knowledge, practice, and legal requirements. So if there is a legal requirement from an international perspective, are we abiding by it by asking for that product to be manufactured in that specific country? What is their market, and understanding what that market is, as well as the transport that's now available. Is it a supplier that is based in a village or a regional area in China, for instance? Does it then take us 3 days to just bring it to a place like Hong Kong, for instance, and then import it from Hong Kong into South Africa? What is that time delay? What is that cycle time delay? So it's understanding all of the different avenues that surround global sourcing and international purchasing, and how best it's going to affect you, or for the better or for the worse. There is some risk when you are purchasing internationally, but from a support from a business perspective is always required. It's not on the onus is not on one person to just find a supplier, source an item, and bring it down. It's a business decision, and the risks need to be taken into account. Okay. So from a global sourcing perspective, as I mentioned, there's a lot of risk, but come with risk, there's also a lot of opportunities relating to global sourcing. So some of the reasons, are quality issues. So there's a lot of pressure, especially within the market, to deliver increased quality or better valued products to different customers. And if you do have in a specific market or environment a lack of skilled labor, or a lack of human intelligence or human capital, as well as technology is limited to produce that specific product in a local setting, imported products become a little bit more valuable than locally produced products. So you have to look at it from a quality perspective. Are you getting better internationally, or are you getting better from a local perspective? Lower cost. Some companies source internationally because of the availability of foreign competition from low-cost producers. I mentioned this already. They have economies of scale. They have low-cost inputs, low labor costs, low raw materials. They have better exchange rates, so they can, get their materials from other places, and they can manufacture the product, which will still actually be cheaper than us getting it from a locally produced supplier. So you have to take in total cost of ownership into account. Total cost of ownership is just not the cost of a particular unit of your item. It's taking into account the labor cost, the maintenance, the logistics, the transport. It's basically your entire landed cost that you're now taking into account, and not just a unit cost. Technological advancements. So what available technologies are there from an international perspective? So a lot of local companies, they want access to global technology that is at the forefront of production, especially within their specific markets. So we've got a little bit limited in terms of research and development on certain aspects. So therefore, we go into the international market to source the technological advancements that's available, so we can reap the benefits of that. Larger product range. Global markets tend to have the ability to meet demand for specific customers because they have many suppliers that can produce a specific item or component for a specific product. From a local perspective, we do have a lack of manufacturing capacity for certain elements of the items. A lot of times, businesses like to focus on what their core competencies are, so what they're good at. So items that they are not so good at, they tend to want to source from an international perspective and bring that in. If they are within a manufacturing field, a lot of times their technology is imported, like their machinery, equipment, etc. So when something does go wrong with it, imports have to happen, of parts and equipment, etc. And then creation of strategic alliances. So basically, your procurement department wants to have or develop a supply base so that you don't have any disruption within your supply chain. So if, for instance, your demand increases, you need to supply more items, which means your production needs to increase, which means you need more raw materials or more components to fill that gap. So a lot of times the alliances with global suppliers, you'll be able to benefit from that perspective because you have multiple suppliers to choose from. You have a cost reduction because you are you're taking into account the TCO, so the total cost of ownership, and the economies of scale. Okay, so that's global sourcing, and I think it's fairly easy to understand the reasons why businesses opt to go the global sourcing route as opposed to the local. However, there is still a flip side from a local. When you are sourcing locally, it can be quicker. You can get your materials a lot quicker. It's just at a cost that you are getting it. You tend to not have a market trend happening, so what you see is what you get. There isn't any adoption of emerging trends or emerging markets that come into play. So it's looking at things, what's going to benefit your business. Is it something local or something that can be globally sourced? All right, then we go into risk management. So global supply chains, they are risky, and I did mention that. There's a lot more factors that go into play as opposed to when you have a local supply chain or local supplier. Some of it is your exchange rate fluctuations. I remember sort of pre-COVID, the rand dollar was doing, fairly okay. And then sort of COVID hit, and we were paying almost double the amount in dollars for a container or an air freight block space. So, just from a transport or logistics perspective, we saw how the exchange rate fluctuated, and a lot of people had changed their supply chains due to that, where they had opted to either find a local supplier because it just didn't make sense for them to import anymore. But I feel as though currently the market is sort of stabilizing, and a lot more people are coming on board in terms of going the global sourcing route. So some of the risks, number one is culture and communication. So we do know this can be a huge disruption to your supply chain. Um, the biggest one is, developing a mutually profitable business relation with a global supplier, but there's cultural differences. The nature, the customs, the ethics of both these organizations, both the supplier and ourselves as a business, it can vary. So there's a lot of obstacles that they then take into play. Like for instance, if we look at it from an ethics perspective, like gift giving, or it differs between what we see as appropriate in the South African market compared to what a global supplier may see being appropriate. Procurement risk, because based on the variation in your exchange rate, it's very difficult to predict any fluctuations in your currency. So today it might be 18 Rand 90, tomorrow it might be 19 Rand 10 to the dollar. So there needs to be a cover charge or a forward cover that, this is what we call it in a logistics perspective, where you are covered for the most in terms of your insurance. So if the exchange rate does go higher, you're not going to be that much affected in terms of, importing a specific product. So all of these sort of variations needs to come into play when you are thinking about importing internationally. Delays. There is obviously a high capacity utilization of imports. So it's very difficult to predict exactly when you can expect stock. So the shipping schedules change on a daily basis. So today we can say we're collecting from Nava Shiva in India, but it may not move. It may only move a week or two from now. Then we have Red Sea disruptions, and we have to reroute the ship. So a 30-day transit time then becomes a 50-day transit time. This can affect your supply chain massively. And that's one of the reasons why having a global supply chain is a lot more difficult than having a local one. A local one, they can tell you about 10 days for manufacturing, and on day 12 you're not getting your products. So this is the difference. Inventory risk. So holding inventory, obviously that is a huge cost for the business. Your demand and supply is very uncertain. You're not sure whether your customers are going to buy it. If you overstock, you're going to sit with cash flow in your business. Is your product gets obsolete? What are you going to do with it? So there's a whole lot of risk that you need to take into account, especially when you have a lot of carrying cost. You need to consider what the freight price is. When are you getting your product? If it is a product that's perishable, then there is an expiration date on it. So all of these needs to be taken into account. Intellectual property risk. Intellectual property can be compromised because there's sort of a vertical integration of the supply chain because you're now globally sourcing. So a lot of what your ideas are in terms of manufacturing, whether you have a specific customized stereo done because it's printing of a specific item onto your product, that has to be shared with your supplier, and it's now it's opening you up for risk. And this can also be the difference between outsourcing and making it yourself. So opening it up to to risk in terms of your intellectual property. Any sort of disasters, from a natural resource, war to terrorism, any labor disputes, if your supplier is under financial distress and goes into bankruptcy, this can all affect you from an importing perspective. Quality risk. So, global purchasing will not be competitive. The quality of the product is not erratic. So it's important to pay very special attention to quality assurance, quality control, supplier specification, any sort of KPIs that you have for your supplier to monitor and measure them in terms of quality. High cost of doing business. So because there's a difference in culture, difference in dialect, there's sometimes a need for having interpreters involved. Distances also can be expensive. Do you need site visits to be done? All of this, it adds on to the costs. So therefore, it just becomes higher when you're doing business globally as opposed to doing it locally. And then system risk. If you have an infrastructure breakdown in terms of your information, you need to take that into account. If there's any sort of breach in the systems that they currently have, if there's hacking, etc., you can't control a lot of these things. So it's how is your information then being outlaid or offloaded into the public? So it's taking all of this into account when you are thinking about investing in a global supply chain as opposed to a local supply chain. Okay, then we move on to our global logistics environment. Okay, and this is broken into a micro environment and a macro environment. Okay, and you can read about this in your textbooks and stuff like that, but I just want to create a very high level overview of what it is. So your micro environment is basically all the factors that is close to the company that affect it either from a positive perspective or a negative perspective. And it then creates a value for relationships within a stakeholder. So some of the micro environment factors is your suppliers, your competitors, your customers, your creditors, your communities, government, trade unions, stakeholders, global intermediaries, your unions, etc. So all of these people that fall within your industry then falls within your micro environment, whereas your macro environment is basically uncontrollable elements. It's elements that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of volatility. It's you have to be a very agile and resilient business to account for the macro environment, and it's basically broader forces that affects people within the industry. So all the micro people, and it influences your business's decision-making process, what your strategy is, how your strategy now is going to change. They also shape some of your opportunities in terms of, how do you now purchase from a procurement perspective, and how does it now, affect your performance in terms of profitability and loss, etc. And your macro environment is your economic forces, ethical forces, technological forces, political and legal, environmental and social, cultural. So you can imagine from an economic perspective, it's your exchange rate, it's your interest rate, it's the economy that you're now doing business with. Ethical forces, is there bribery? Is there corruption? Technology, is there a need for innovation? How can you do best practices from maybe your business doesn't have the technological advances that a global player now has. Political and legal issues. So is it, maybe it's a time of election in that specific country, or even in our country. Maybe there's a war that broke out. Environmental forces from a sustainability perspective. What is the market now telling us from a competition perspective? So it's looking at it from a micro and a macro element, and then understanding who your different stakeholders are within it, and how do they now affect your decision to look into a global sourcing initiative, or look into things from a global logistics perspective. Does it make sense for you to be importing these items when all of these factors come into play, or are you now willing to take the risk? So it's asking yourself that question as a business. Okay, so then the next one is our foreign entry, foreign market entry, sorry. And a lot of it comes from an exporting perspective. And exporting, I think, very self-explanatory, but it's when your organization or your business has a production facility or a manufacturing facility in its home country, and then it sells its products to an outside country. Okay. So exporting basically requires the least amount of knowledge, the least amount of commitment. It has the lowest risk because it's you as a domestic or a local based business that is allowing a freight forwarder or an international carrier to carry out the logistics of your specific product. And a business can export its goods to a foreign customer or any sort of foreign or export intermediaries. And from an advantage perspective, you have, a lot of flexibility, because as a business, you don't need any investments from a foreign market, because your package, your design, your sales, everything is being done from a local perspective. All you need is your documentation, which can be a normal, commercial invoice, a packing list that you draft, and whether the supplier decides or your customer now decides that they want to export the item themselves or you exporting it on their behalf, it's now just contacting a local logistics provider to do this information for you, to move this for you. Licensing. So licensing is basically the agreement that allows an organization in one country, so the licensee basically, to use the manufacturing, trademark, technical assistance, etc., or other skills provided by a licensor that's located in another country. So it's basically like an intangible property, like a patent or a copyright or a trademark or any sort of formula that is now carried out in a global country that we now need in order for us to produce the exact same item locally. So, for instance, there's like Nando's, for instance, they carry a license for for their for their recipe. I think KFC is probably a better option, the Colonel Burger or something like that. And they have a recipe of how they make their specific items, and they then export this out into a franchise. So their franchise can be basically anywhere in the world, and they then sell their licenses, and only that specific person who has their licenses can then manufacture or produce that specific item or that specific element of their business. So it's understanding how licensing works, and then you're able to then bring it down. So there is a lot of businesses from a fashion perspective that has a South African entity or a South African bank statement, or CIPC, and based on that, they can then produce an international brand locally. I've seen that. I mean, some of them are even my customers. And all they do is they just hold a license, but they maintain production and manufacturing within the country. But it's not a brand that ex- that that was birthed in South Africa. It's a brand that was birthed in from a global perspective. Okay. Joint venture. Um, so from a joint venture perspective, it involves the company joining ventures basically with a foreign company, to sell or market a product or service. It's establishing a business that is jointly owned by two or more independent organizations. So if one organization decides that they want to have, more control over its international operations, then they need to put it into an agreement. If someone wants to have more control over the sales part of it, it needs to be an agreement, but it is a JV that, all parties then need to agree on. And there's a lot of input from a South African perspective as well as a global perspective. And there is many examples of that from a corporate side, of JVs that existed where, international companies, decided to buy from a local perspective, or not buy, but joint venture with it. And the international company will take greater control over the manufacturing, and then they would export the items into South Africa. And then South Africa will then run sales. They then commit to a specific target or a specific budget, and then based on that, they then take it forward. Okay, then we have wholly owned subsidiaries, and this means that the investing firm is owning 100% of the new entity in the host country. So the ownership can come through an acquisition, or an expansion. And some of the advantages of this is it minimizes the startup cost in a foreign market. So you won't need to locate or build any facilities, hire employees, establish supply chain relationships. All of this is already established. So basically what you're doing is you have retention of that control. And then over time, what happens is, businesses that are wholly owned, they tend to make changes about a year to sometimes 3 years after the agreement is takes place. Okay, then we have importing, which is basically involves the purchase of goods from foreign sources. The items being imported can be used immediately in a production process, or it can be used in part of a manufacturing process. They're sold to a customer, they're transported to other ports of entry. They're either stored in a bonded facility, or they are basically just cleared and delivered basically at the same time. And clearing and delivering, obviously, you need to have that cash up front, to make sure that you're covering those initiatives that allow you to now gain entry of that specific product. Then we have counter trade. So counter trade means that you are exchanging goods or services which are paid for either in totality or a part of it with other goods rather than with money. So it's like a bartering system, something like that. Counter trade links to normal unrelated transactions. So it means the sale of a product in a foreign country and the sale of a good out of that particular country. So it's like a barter or a swap or a buyback, or you want to offset one product with another product, just to give you a few examples. Okay. All right, so then we have international market intermediaries. So these are basically the people or the consolidation, import and export services, and they are the market leaders, or basically the people that have the most amount of expertise when it comes to logistics and moving items from point A to point B from a global perspective and using global transactions. So the first one is a customs broker. So the customs broker moves international shipments through customs for various different businesses and organizations, and they handle any sort of documentation that's required to move with the shipment. So these people, they're often used by organizations or businesses who require the expertise in exporting goods or importing any sort of goods. These are people that have the knowledge of requirements between two different countries, and they can reduce the time that's required to move goods internationally and clear the goods. So it's very important to understand. I think the next slide is going to go through documentation that's required when we look at foreign or global sourcing. But a customs broker is really important, because if you make one mistake on a tariff code or one mistake on an Incoterm, it ends up costing the business a lot of money. A tariff code basically identifies your or classifies your product in a specific category. Different categories attract different duty prices. So if you are now saying you have an item and you're putting a tariff code that is a fashion item or an apparel item, that's normally duty payable at 40%. Or you have, and then you have an item, which is the actual item, that attracts a duty of 10%. You're now paying 30% more duties on a specific item. You can go back and change it, but you have to outlay the money first, pay customs, have your shipment release, and then apply for a VOC. So it's called a voucher of credit. And this takes anything between 9 to 12 weeks to get processed. So you're now sitting without a cash flow for almost 9 to 12 weeks, purely because you didn't use the correct expertise to clear and deliver your shipment, and to make sure that you had the appropriate documentation to do so. So customs brokers are actually very important in this category. International or foreign freight forwarders. They basically move goods for companies from a domestic production facility to a foreign customer's destination using either air freight, sea freight, etc., and within warehouses. They consolidate your smaller shipments into larger container shipments, and they decide what mode of transport you need, what methods to use. They handle the documentation and then disperse the shipment to the destination. So in the logistics environment, I sit in the international or foreign freight forwarder market, or part of. And this is exactly what we do. So if a customer has to come to us and say, we want you to move 52 pallets of items from China, bring it into South Africa, I can then say to them, okay, what is your product? Or, confirm the tariff heading. What is your, where's your import documentation? We go through a checklist. We confirm that everything is correct. I say, okay, here's your shipping schedule. You booked on MSC 123, departing on or sailing on the 4th of September. So I make all of the arrangements. I would then collect the items from the supplier's door, take it to port, get it loaded onto a vessel, maintain communication for that 30 to 35 days with the customer, just to let them know when they can expect it. When it does disembark at port, then the clearance happens. So either pre-clearance or normal clearance. Based on that, is it going into a bonded facility or is it being delivered to a customer? So all of this is the requirements for a freight forwarder to do. and it's it's where the expertise sit as well. Trading companies basically puts the buyers and sellers from different countries together and handle all of the export or import arrangement, documentation, and transport for both goods and services. A lot of trading companies are involved in exporting, so they usually take the title of the goods until it's sold to a foreign buyer. They have economies of scale when they export these goods because they ship in large quantities of consolidated shipments using established transportation and warehousing services. So what happens is you have sort of a middleman that will go to a supplier, buy a whole lot of products, find the buyers, import it or export it into a specific country, and then they will sell it. Because they're buying in quantities, they're getting a lower cost per product. And because they are shipping in bulk, they are getting a better rand per kg or dollar per kg, and they can then sell it at a better landed cost, on the ground. Then the last one is a non-vessel operating common carrier. It's also known as a NVOCC. And this is very similar to a freight forwarder, international freight forwarder, but they use scheduled ocean liners. So they consolidate small international shipments from a number of different shippers into a full container load, and then they handle all of the documentation and transport from the shipper's dock area. They also handle distribution to consignees at the destination dock area. So basically what it is, if you go to an NVOCC, they will have a number of different smaller shipments coming from the same destination. They will consolidate and take ownership of that, 20-foot, 40-foot FCL. When they do take ownership of that, they are then in charge of putting together documentation for each one. So every single product needs to carry its own documentation. So you are not importing illegal stuff into the country, and documentation is very, very important, and it needs to be at the forefront of, when you are importing. And an NVOCC basically puts all of that together for you. Okay, so that covers the international market intermediaries. Is there any questions so far? Okay. Okay, then we go on to our documentation. So when goods basically cross any of your borders, okay, whether it's a sea freight border, road freight border, whatever it is, there's a lot of documentation that's required to make sure that your business or your product is being transferred legally in that specific country, and you are abiding by the rules and regulations that they've set out in terms of where their border is sitting or their customs clearance is sitting. So similarly, when you travel from passenger perspective, you need to have your passport, you need to have a visa, you need to have whatever that country's requirement is, you need to have that covered. When you go in there, you go through border control. Border control then will be able to say, okay, yes, you can go, no, you can't go. Very similarly, it works the same way with goods and products that needs to be exported or imported. So the first one is a sales contract. It's probably one of the most important documentation that's used when you are moving shipments internationally. It basically aligns with what the buyer and the seller agreed upon. And it describes what the product is, what language was used, the pricing, the payment structure, insurance, who is your logistics provider, so who have you authorized to move your product, etc. So it basically just gives the customs official a very high level overview of exactly what the transaction is. A certificate of origin. So the exporter, so the person who is selling the item to you as a business, issues a certificate of origin. Okay, so it's called a COO document. It not only certifies the origin of the product, but it also ensures that the tariff codes and the duties that is applicable and negotiated between the two countries is correctly applied, and there's no abuse of it. So in South Africa, we've got the Chamber of Commerce that basically facilitates the certificate of origin. So as a freight forwarder or even as a business, I will have to go in to the Chamber of Commerce, and I would have to apply for the certificate of origin for that specific product. I need to take in my sales contract, my commercial invoice, what is my packing list, if my products are dangerous, what is my material safety data sheet look like. So all that relevant information I need to take forward in order for me to get a COO. The Chamber of Commerce is then responsible for granting this to me. The import license. So before an organization can export any sort of good, it needs an import license from the government, basically. So SARS normally aligns themselves with an importers exporters code, is what we call it in South Africa. And once you get this code, you are able to freely import and export. If you are a first-time importer or first-time exporter, you can do, I think it's up to 2 or 3, but small shipments on your ID, so you can clear it on that. But if you are a business that's consistently doing importing and exporting, a import license or an import and exporter's code is what's required. The bill of lading. Okay, so this is basically like your waybill. Okay, it represents the transport agreement or the transport contract between the carrier and the exporter or its agents. It will specify what is your weight, your description, what's the quantity of your product, who's going to receive the good, and any other details. You know, when we're delivering, do you need a crane truck? Do you need a, what sort of vehicle are we delivering on? And the bill of lading is then required for us to clear the goods through customs so that the customer itself can take ownership of the goods and can pay for the duties and taxes, etc. Commercial invoice. So your exporter, so the person who is selling the item, issues the packing list and the commercial invoice. So the commercial invoice and packing list, it basically provides you with the detailed information on what is contained within that particular shipment or container. So it's used by customs for inspection purposes. And it's used by the buyer to make sure that the full order has been delivered. So when a shipment is stopped at the port for inspection, it means a physical inspection, which means that the customs official goes directly into the container. They then make sure that if you listed, you've got 500 units of something, you do have 500 units of something, and everything marries up in terms of your sales contract, your COO, your licenses, everything is now aligned to what your commercial invoice or your packing list is now speaking on. Inspection documents. So countries around the world have different legislations. What is the health legislation? Sorry, just give me 1 second. Just logged off quickly. Okay, there we go. So your inspection document, so countries around the world basically have different legislations, such as health legislation if you're importing a good that is like a fruit or a plant, for instance. So anything that can contain organisms gets inspected and has to go through a different set of officials. We have like phytosanitary certificates that needs to be done when it's a plant-based item or an animal-based product, etc. And you need port health inspectors to come and view that. A port health takes anything between 3 to 5 working days to actually physically do an inspection. So that adds on to your transit time or your timeline when it comes to release of your product or release of your shipment. And then packing list, very similar to a commercial invoice. It's just a detailed list of information regarding the contents. And your exporter is the one who issues this, and your customs official uses it to make sure that everything is aligned in terms of the product. Okay, so how do we now pay for these items? So now we already know that we want to buy something from a global player or a global supplier. How do we now pay for this? So the first one is, and a lot of people now use this, is a letter of credit. And it's basically a legal instrument or a legal document that it constitutes as a cash guarantee, which obligates the bank to make a payment to that particular supplier within a specific time frame when documents like your bill of lading, your COO, your insurance, your packing list, commercial invoice, so all the documents that we spoke about is presented. And then the bank uses this at the request of your buyer, and they can then facilitate the payment once the item is basically delivered. So a lot of them use the letter of credit because, let's be honest, it's not always safe to just do a direct EFT transfer for a full truckload of items or products, and you're not sure whether you're going to get it or not, or you're not sure whether you received all of the items or not. So the bank will issue a guarantee. So there is an agreement. The bank will be a middleman between yourself and your supplier. And it will basically be a promise by the bank that yes, you will definitely get paid, but you will get paid based on the conditions that you give me all of these documentation. So there's three types. Number one is your irrevocable versus revocable. So an irrevocable letter of credit can't be cancelled, or it can't be modified without the consent of the beneficiary. So meaning the person who is now receiving it. Okay. Confirmed versus unconfirmed. So a bank that confirms a letter of credit then takes the risk. Okay. The best method of payment in most cases for a business that is sourcing items globally is an irrevocable letter of credit. Some banks basically don't like to assume the risk or take the risk. Therefore, they go more on the irrevocable credit or letter of credit, as opposed to going as a confirmed, yes, we are going to take the risk. The banks sit there as an advisory role and as a middleman without assuming any risk at all. And then revolving credit versus non-revolving credit. So non-revolving letters of credit are valid only for one transaction. So when the relationship is established, you have a revolving letter of credit, and that can be issued, but it can only be used for one transaction. So if there is another transaction that's coming into play at a later stage with the same supplier, you would then need to probably opt for an irrevocable letter of credit. The second one is an open account. So it's very similar to your home transactions, in which goods are shipped and documents are then sent to the buyer with an invoice to pay on set agreed terms. So if it is a cash on delivery, so COD, is it a 30-day payment term, 60 days, 90 days? So whenever that's specified, your supplier provides the goods on an open account to specific buyers, and it normally happens when you have trust with your supplier. So your supplier trusts you. They have an open credit facility. You can buy whatever you want. They ship it then to you. You ship it to yourself. And then once you receive it, you can then pay them. So there is no middleman intercepting this relationship. It's a complete trust relationship between yourself and your supplier. Okay. And then the last one is use of drafts or bills of exchange. So these are basically handed to the importer for payment. So the importer will be us as a business, to payment with a negotiable document. So they then accept the drafts upon submission of the document, and we take possession of the items or the products, paying before the draft expires. So the bill of lading and any other shipping documents should accompany the draft before payment is done. Previously, a lot of people used to do drafts or bills of exchange, but it's not as common now. A lot of people are going the letter of credit route, and a lot more is now going the open account route, but that's completely based on trust aspect. If you're dealing with a small business and you have a direct relationship with the owner of that organization, then open account is the way to go. If it's a bigger organization, they don't exactly go on the open account, so we now go on an irrevocable letter of credit. Okay. And then the last slide, okay, is Incoterms. Incoterms, absolutely important when you are shipping anything from a logistics perspective, because it basically puts the onus of different aspects into either the buyer or the seller's hands. And an Incoterm is, it's a lot more complex when you are internationally buying. Therefore, all of this needs to be stipulated. So International Chamber of Commerce created these Incoterms. Okay, and Incoterms means international commercial terms. And it's basically a uniform set of rules to clarify where the cost is sitting, where the risk is sitting, where's the insurance sitting, what is the responsibility of the buyer, what is the responsibility of the seller on an international commercial transaction. So this does not change. If you go into China, they'll speak on the same Incoterms. If it's the States, if it's the UK, if it's South Africa, everybody uses the exact same Incoterms that's listed here. And it also determines who pays for the freight cost, who's the carrier, who handles the import clearance, who handles the export clearance, and who handles the insurance. So everything is basically just freely explained. So just so very high level, I'll explain each one, well, some to you, so you have an idea. Ex Works, probably one of the most communicated one right now. It's where the seller makes the goods available to the buyer and at the seller's own premises, which means that the buyer takes full responsibility of the product, meaning from the time it's collected from the seller's property right until it's delivered to the buyer's door. That's exactly what happens. It becomes an Ex Works delivery. Insurance, risk, cost, freight cost, logistics cost, everything then falls on the existing party to now take into account. Under the F term, so FCA, FAS, FOB, the seller is to deliver the goods to a carrier appointed by the buyer. So it's the seller's responsibility to make sure that the goods are delivered to an international freight forwarder's premises. And from there, it then gets shipped and then it becomes the buyer's responsibility. So when I say premises, it can be the port, it can be a freight forwarder's premises, but majority of the time it's the port, either an airport or a seaport. Under this sort of C term, so your CFRs, your CIFs, your CPTs, CIPs, the seller has to contract for carriage, but without assuming the risk of loss or damage to the goods due to the events occurring after shipment or dispatch. Okay, so the seller is basically under contract to make sure that they carry the items, but they're not assuming the risk. They're still passing the risk and the insurance, etc., onto the buyer. And then the D term, which we don't come across very easily besides your DDP and DDUs, but the D term, so DES, DQ, DDPU, and DDP, the seller has to bear all the costs, all the risks that's needed to bring the goods to the destination. So your supplier is involved with basically all of this. So Ex Works meaning your buyer, DDP meaning your supplier, and they're covering full term. So most common Incoterms that's being used right now is Ex Works, FOB, CFR, CPT, and DDP. Those are the ones that you probably would see the most if you ever get into a logistics or a procurement or a supply chain environment. Those will be the most functional items or Incoterms that you would use. So it is always beneficial to understand Incoterms, whether you are sitting in a shipping environment, logistics environment, or just as a supplier that is involved with procurement and operations. It's nice to understand Incoterms because it is an international commercial term set out by the Chamber of Commerce. So it's always nice to understand because this sort of stuff doesn't change. It has been here for years and it will be here for many more years to come. Okay. So that concludes our session today. I'm sorry it was that long. It was just it's quite a big topic that we had to cover today. Is there any questions so far?
No, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. You guys have a fantastic evening and good luck with the ice husk. And
Thank you.
Chat next week. Well, we have a pre-recorded session next week, so I'll load that on, and then a national support session in our live lecture or our live session the following week on the 17th, and then we can discuss assignment 1, anything that we need to know about assignment 2. We'll discuss all of that. Okay, chat soon, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.